International news now.
We want to spend the rest of the class talking about the broader political and military conflict over the North Korean nuclear program. Now, North Korea conducted a series of successful missile and nuclear bomb tests in 2016 and 2017 that provoked a military crisis between the United States and North Korea. It's clear that the United States seriously considered launching some type of military action against North Korea. The two leaders of the countries exchanged a series of personal insults, some over Twitter.
Okay. Yeah.
And then in the spring of 2018, both sides stepped back from the crisis. The leaders of the United States and North Korea even held a summit in June of this year in Singapore. This was a breakthrough in the relationship. Now, President Trump claims that North Korea has committed to giving up its nuclear weapons. They even discussed the possibility of a formal peace treaty to end the Korean War. Now, since the Singapore summit, the two sides have made little hard progress towards achieving some of the broader goals associated with denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. The president recently canceled a scheduled visit by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo over the lack of this progress. And yesterday, Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, held an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council to criticize Russia and China for their failure to uphold the broader sanctions regime against North Korea. Now, we want to cover this story in 5 parts today. First, we're going to trace the origins of this conflict back to the early stages of the Cold War. Second, we're going to watch a video that gives us some background on the North Korean nuclear weapons program that takes off in the 1990s. Then we're going to review some of the prominent developments in the evolution of this crisis from 2016 to 2018. And we really want to paint a picture of the larger strategic situation that the United States finds itself in. Fourth, we're going to talk some about the Singapore summit from June of this year. And then we're going to conclude by updating you on developments over the past week.
Okay, so let's begin then by tracing this conflict back to the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. The defeat of Japan in World War II ended its colonial administration over Korea. So back in 1943, the Allies in World War II had made the decision to strip Japan of all of its overseas colonial territories after the war. And so the United States and the Soviet Union negotiated a division of the Korean Peninsula along the famous 38th parallel in August of 1945. The United States took responsibility for administering the south of that region, south of the parallel, and the Soviet Union took responsibility for administering the north. At the time, there were about 16 million Koreans living in the south of this line and 9 million living to the north of the line. Both occupying powers helped establish governments in their occupation zone that would be friendly to their political interests. So they were trying to solidify their own goals by establishing governments that were similar in their outlook to their own. So by 1947, the United States began to take steps to end the military regime in South Korea. And it wanted to turn power over to a local government and sought help from the United Nations to oversee elections over the future governments of both the North and South in Korea. The Soviets resisted these efforts and refused to allow elections in the North, the occupation zone that they controlled. So that's where that stood. They made the so then the United States made the decision to hold elections just in the South. However, this provoked widespread public opposition in South Korea. People worried that this would permanently partition Korea, the whole Korean peninsula, into North and South, and they were right? The Korean War broke out in June of 1950 when North Korea invaded South Korea. This followed a period of domestic upheaval on both sides of the 38th parallel. This was a civil war. Both governments still had not established their legitimacy, and both relied on foreign support to keep them in power. Now, we should think about the Korean War as another front in the emerging Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union that followed the end of World War II. Under Mao Zedong, the Chinese Communist Party had just declared the extended civil war in China. This was a significant defeat. The victory of Mao Zedong and the Communist Party in China over the nationalist forces in that civil war was a significant defeat for American policy in East Asia because it had long planned, the United States had long planned, on having a different anti-communist government in power in China as its ally. So it was relying on China being an ally of the United States, and when the Communist Party won, instead, that conflict within China, that was a big loss for the U.S. As a consequence, the U.S. fought with South Korea, on the side of South Korea. The Soviet Union and China supported the North in this civil war in Korea. And China intervened on the side of North Korea in October 1950 when it looked like American and South Korean forces might defeat the North Korean regime and cross over into China. And so China actually sent in their own troops to stop this. So the sides fought the Korean War to a stalemate and ended military hostilities in 1953 with an armistice. And this is important. There was no formal peace treaty at the end of this conflict. They just had a ceasefire, basically, that has lasted for 60 years, 70 years, about.
65.
65, okay.
It's hard to do math on the fly.
That's right. Well, almost. So, North and South Korea are still technically at war. Now, this conflict remained an important component of the Cold War. The U.S. put troops in the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, to ensure the North Korea, doesn't invade South Korea again. It didn't want to lose South Korea because then Japan would be threatened, right? U.S. troops in the DMZ serve as what's called a tripwire, right? There's not enough U.S. troops to actually repel an invasion. They will get overwhelmed by the vast number of North Korean troops that would come over in a land invasion. Instead, it's a psychological policy. It's meant to reassure allies that the United States is committed to their defense by having some skin in the game, so to speak, by actually having troops that, if there was an invasion, would be casualties of that invasion and then put immense pressure on the U.S., investing more resources and intervening militarily in the subsequent conflict. So it also sends a signal to China and then the Soviet Union that an invasion of South Korea would provoke American intervention. So and we'll talk a lot more about this when we talk about nuclear weapons. U.S. troops they serve as a deterrent to preserve peace. So Jim Mattis argues that the U.S. Troops then are there to prevent World War III. That's his explanation when Donald Trump says, "Why are we wasting
all this money? Why don't we just pull out?" Right.
Right. And so this relationship then evolves with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Right. The North remains allied with China, and the South remains allied with the United States. And so we want to watch a video now from Vox that gives us some background on how this conflict has evolved after the Cold War. And it is going to briefly describe the development of the North Korean nuclear program in the 1990s and begin to discuss the escalation of tensions between the United States and North Korea over the period from 2016 to 2018, because this was a crisis period. The video will then begin by answering this question: why does North Korea want to acquire and maintain a nuclear weapons program?
Why is North Korea so dead set on building an ICBM? The North Koreans first got nuclear technology in the 1950s, when their ally, the Soviet Union, helped them build nuclear reactors for energy. At the same time, they were protected from their enemies, South Korea and the US, by the massive nuclear arsenal of the Soviet Union. But in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, that protection went away. So North Korean dictator Kim Jong-il took matters into his own hands and started using the nuclear reactors to make weapons. The US didn't want an aggressive rogue state to have nuclear weapons, so 3 consecutive US presidents all tried different tactics to get North Korea to stop. Clinton negotiated, Bush suspended negotiations and threatened them, and Obama simply tried to wait North Korea out. But every single plan failed to stop the nuclear program, and there's a reason for that. See, the Kim dynasty believes their only option for security is to have proven nuclear capabilities. They saw the US invade Iraq and topple Saddam Hussein because they thought he might have nukes. They also saw Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi negotiate with the US and give up his nuclear program, only to be killed by US-backed rebels. The Kim dynasty is determined not to be next. So they've gone on to build an arsenal of missiles for their nuclear bombs. The Nodong is functional today and has a range of 1,500 kilometers. And North Korea's Scud missiles are highly effective within 1,000 kilometers. This puts North Korea's main enemies, South Korea and Japan, within range, as well as the 62,000 US troops stationed there. In fact, North Korea wants to make that loud and clear, and it does so by successfully testing these short-range missiles a lot. The tests provide a chance for them to improve their missiles, but more importantly, they send a political message. South Korea and Japan wouldn't attack North Korea because they've seen the missiles that could devastate some of their largest cities. Also, they don't have nuclear weapons of their own. So what's keeping North Korea from attacking its enemies? The US is, which has promised to protect South Korea and Japan with the largest ICBM arsenal in the world. This puts North Korea at a disadvantage. It knows the US can obliterate it, but it can't reach the US just yet. This is why the US can safely cut off North Korean trade and enact other punishments. And this brings us back to why North Korea has been trying so hard to build an ICBM. It's what they need to tip the scales in their favor. Right now, North Korea can only attack US allies, but if it can successfully test any of these ICBMs, it would be the same as telling the US, if you nuke us, we'll nuke you. If the US knows North Korea can target an American city, it'll be less likely to come to the aid of South Korea or Japan. This would effectively break up the alliance that's designed to keep North Korea in check. But the implications of this would go far beyond the Korean Peninsula. Suddenly, in charge of their own protection, South Korea and Japan would potentially develop nuclear weapons of their own, something Donald Trump once said he would be fine with. This would trigger a process called nuclear proliferation, and it's exactly what the US has been trying to prevent since the Cold War. Right now there are 9 countries with nuclear weapons of their own, while 190 maintain a non-nuclear status because of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But the success of a North Korean ICBM could change that. If South Korea and Japan start looking to change their nuclear status, it could encourage other countries to do the same. So experts are urging the US to take action now while it still can. President Trump is pressing China to help. See, China continues to trade and have a diplomatic relationship with North Korea, essentially keeping the regime alive. So if Trump can get China to leverage or cut off that support, North Korea might not have enough resources to keep pursuing an ICBM. But for now, as North Korea continues to test and parade missiles, tensions continue to rise. 3 US presidents have said they'd prevent the North from building better nukes and missiles. 3 US presidents have failed. At least for now, it looks like Donald Trump will be the 4th.
All right, let's make a few crucial points here. First, the big takeaway from this video is that nuclear weapons serve, at least from the perspective of North Korea, as the only guarantee of regime security for the North Korean government. The way they see things, nuclear weapons protect North Korea from invasion and attack by the United States and its allies. And they base this perception not just on what leaders and governments say, but also on concrete actions from the past. They view the legacy of the American invasion of Iraq, which said they had weapons of mass destruction but really didn't, and also the toppling of Gaddafi in Libya as concrete evidence after he gave up his nuclear weapons, as concrete evidence of what happens to regimes that the United States doesn't like if they don't have a nuclear deterrent to hinder the United States from engaging in regime change through military invasion. And the Libya example is particularly important because Gaddafi was killed and because John Bolton, the current U.S. National Security Advisor, has publicly invoked the Libya example in statements about North Korea as a good way to handle this, right? And that, you know, is very disconcerting for North Korea, because that's exactly the way North Korea does not want this scenario to unfold. And so, bottom line is, they see their own self-preservation, especially the leadership, tied to the possession of nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles.
So, and think about this, has huge implications for the likelihood of ever achieving a deal that would involve North Korea giving up its nuclear weapons.
Right.
The U.S. is going to have to make some
high threshold.
Yeah. The U.S. is, in all likelihood, it's not going to happen. The U.S. would have to give some set of security commitments or guarantees saying that the U.S. would never invade or try to topple the North Korean regime. But how do you do that?
Yeah, and how do you make a guarantee when you've got an administration that isn't going to have a lot of trust or enjoy a lot of trust with this regime?
All right, so second, we want to give you, and recall here, so coming out of this video, we want to give you a better sense of the strategic situation between the U.S. and North Korea and what's happened over the last couple of years. And so the second thing we want to talk about here is to give you some sense of the nuclear capabilities that North Korea possesses. Why are these things a threat? And it's important here first to differentiate between nuclear bombs from the missiles that are capable of delivering those bombs. So North Korea conducted its first successful test of a nuclear bomb in 2006. I think they've conducted 6 tests in total. Intelligence analysts, as the video just mentioned, suggest that the North Korea has about 60 nuclear bombs right now. It's sped up this phase of testing these nuclear weapons in 2016. It's conducted 3 tests in 2016 and 2017. More importantly, and what has really triggered the crisis from the middle of 2017 until March of 2018, when it was most intense, was that North Korea made significant progress in developing an ICBM, or an intercontinental ballistic missile, capable of being launched from North Korea, leaving the Earth's atmosphere, re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, and then striking a target inside of the continental United States. This has been a significant development, and it opens up the U.S. homeland to now being at risk. And so this is a significant change in the technological capacity of North Korea that's been reached in the last 12 to 18 months. The U.S. homeland's at risk, and this potentially offsets a significant American strategic advantage in the ability to deliver a nuclear strike between the two countries.
We could bomb them, but they didn't have the technology to bomb us directly.
And now they have that, potentially have that capacity. It also means that U.S. citizens could be hostages in a crisis in which the North Korean regime says, don't think about invading us, because if you invade us, we're going to launch an attack on Seattle or San Francisco. I want to be clear about the technological capacity that North Korea has right now. So it appears that they have an ICBM that's capable of reaching the U.S. homeland. What's unclear is whether they have the technology for that nuclear weapon that would be put on the top of that ICBM, for that nuclear weapon to be able to survive re-entry into the U.S.'s atmosphere. Unclear whether they have that. In a sense, that's the final step, but they're close. Third, let's talk now about why the U.S. cares so much about this, and we already mentioned this, right, is that these weapons and capabilities, they act as a threat both to the United States and its allies, in particular South Korea and Japan. And so the position of the U.S. government over the last 25 years, really since the end of the Cold War, is that this position is unsustainable. We cannot allow North Korea to acquire and maintain nuclear weapons. That's the public position of the U.S. administration, but the reality is that successive presidents, going back to President Clinton, have allowed North Korea to make significant progress on these fronts, and they now have nuclear weapons.
They're kicking the can down the road,
yes.
which President Obama admitted was taking place and warned President Trump when he was entering office, this will be your biggest foreign policy challenge, North Korea and its acquisition of nuclear weapons.
So the fourth thing we want to talk about is just to give you a brief history here in sense of and to note that the U.S. and North Korea engaged in this extended political and military crisis from 2016 until the spring of this year in 2018. There was an exchange of verbal threats between two sides. There was a series of military maneuvers. We see real escalation. In January and February of this year, there was a real concern that the U.S. was preparing for a military strike. Bob Woodward details a series of military maneuvers in the Ozarks, in which the United States and the U.S. Air Force was simulating an attack on a North Korean leadership compound. The reason we know about this is because they didn't have operational security on their communications in the Ozarks, and so people listening to the military frequencies heard conversations about, we just got the North Korean leader and stuff like this in the simulation. There was an important op-ed that was released by someone who was going to be the U.S. ambassador to South Korea, Victor Cha, in, what was it, February of this year, where he said, I am withdrawing my name from consideration because I'm concerned that the U.S. is moving towards launching a war against North Korea, which could potentially kill hundreds of thousands of people. So we see this escalation of tensions between the two sides, and it's really worse in the final quarter of 2017. We've got some video clips now of these exchanges. We're going to run two back-to-back between the leaders of the two countries.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. He has been very threatening beyond a normal statement. And as I said, they will be met with fire, fury, and frankly, power, the likes of which this world has never seen before. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tit for tat continued at the United Nations General Assembly.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
It's an absurd reality. A person like Trump, a mentally deranged person full of megalomania and complacency, holds the nuclear button.
Over the weekend, President Trump tweeted that if North Korean officials repeated specific threats, they won't be around much longer. And the North Korean foreign minister responded,
Since the United States declared war on our country, we have every right to take countermeasures, including shooting down the United States strategic bombers. The question of who will be around much longer will be answered then.
Today, President Trump repeated his threats and said Kim Jong-un started it.
He's saying things that should never, ever be said, and we're replying to those things, but it's a reply. It's not an original statement, it's a reply.
Okay, first thing to say about this is these, at that time, during that crisis, that was scary, right? That the rhetoric had been escalating beyond anything that had occurred in earlier presidencies and the like. And the personal attacks really had many worried that this was going to be a test of wills between two individuals who thought that, that were determined to outdo each other, right?
And keep in mind with this is that the military reality has changed, right? This crisis is occurring with a changed military reality in which North Korea now potentially has the capacity to strike with nuclear weapons inside of the United States.
Right.
So what are they doing here? Why are they exchanging, why are they escalating, why are they exchanging these public messages? Why are they escalating the conflict, well, one of the things that they're doing is they're trying to communicate. They're talking to each other and they're trying to signal their resolve to each other. And they do this by escalating the crisis, threatening to make things worse. They're in a sense trying to pressure each other into backing down, into making concessions. The problem is that these efforts to communicate resolve and seriousness have the spillover effect of escalating the crisis and raising the possibility of war that both sides, neither side probably wants.
Right. We're going to be talking more about this when we talk about nuclear weapons. There's a whole theory around credibility and using threats like this. So
now, something else we got to point out in terms of this conflict and whether or not military force can be used to resolve it is we have to talk about the geography of the conflict. And it's really constraining here. And if you talk to military specialists, strategic analysts that have been studying this for decades, and they say there's no option here. That in a sense, geography dictates peace. Why is that the case? Seoul, a city of over 10 million people, is 35 miles from the demilitarized zone. If a war were to occur, the US and South Korean forces couldn't protect the citizens living in Seoul. They would come under a horrible artillery barrage from the North Korea, parked on the northern side of the DMZ, tremendous loss of life. And so if we're thinking about this in terms of the perspective of what if an American president is first concerned about protecting American lives in this conflict, the other thing to keep in mind is that there's over 140,000 US citizens living in Seoul. What this geographic reality does is it effectively takes, well, people are going to disagree about this, but it puts tremendous constraints off a military option for resolving this conflict. It creates a stable deterrence. And incidentally, this was one of the reasons why Bannon was fired as the chief advisor for President Trump back in 2017, because he gave an interview where he said basically this: there is no military solution. We can't go to war. It's off the table.
And realize exactly why he would get fired perhaps for something like that, because the threat, no one really wants to use military power like that, or the threat of an attack, the use of an attack, but it is effective potentially to threaten attacks. But if everyone believes, well, you're not really going to do that, then the threats themselves are not going to accomplish their goal. And so you've got a very complicated psychological dynamic here that they're playing.
And you can think about this in terms of coordinating U.S. foreign policy and the challenges we talked about at the beginning of the class. So if you have an advisor that comes out and says, we can't engage in military force to resolve this conflict, what kind of pressure does that put on President Trump then to make more bold statements about we're willing to use military force, in a sense, to distance and undermine that position? There's a coordination problem here as well. The last thing we want to talk about is if the U.S. doesn't have military options on the table, how has it been exerting, and how has the U.S. and its allies and the rest of the world been exerting pressure on the North Korean regime to try and get them to give up their nuclear weapons? They've relied heavily on a tough sanctions regime that has been designed to choke off all trade with North Korea and impose severe economic pain on this. The problem with the sanctions regime, or the challenge in terms of implementing is that you need compliance from your trading partners, particularly China and now Russia. And so if countries step back from this trading regime and say, well, we're going to go ahead and trade on our own, then it undermines the ability of the U.S. and its allies to put pressure on the North Korean regime to impose pain and costs to try to get them to give up their nuclear weapons. One thing important in the sanctions regime, and this has implications for talking about Iran, and one of the primary ways that the U.S. has leverage in these sanctions regimes, even if, say, China or Russia says, we're going to go back on this, is the U.S. can enforce sanctions through its financial institutions. And so it can then penalize any international firm, any multinational corporation that does business, say with Iran or North Korea. They say, well, if you do business with them, if you're trading with them, we're going to deny you access to U.S. financial institutions, U.S. banks. Right. They rely on capital, but they're also moving, big multinational corporations, they're moving money across 10, 20, 30 locations around the world. If they don't have access to U.S. banks and banks that do business with U.S. banks, they don't have access to cash. They can't do business. And so this is an important, effective mechanism. We're going to talk about this in a little bit, in 10 or 12 minutes. what's happened in the aftermath of the Singapore summit is that China, and this is why Nikki Haley was at the UN yesterday, held an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council, is that it looks like China and Russia are stepping back. They're encouraging their firms to engage in more business with North Korea because it looks like the pressure has slowed down and perhaps the Trump administration isn't as serious about maintaining sanctions to get a deal.
Okay, so just to be clear, even though the United States has a very difficult time actually using military force because of geography, right, and the threat to, say, Seoul, the capital of South Korea, that does not mean it doesn't have options. And the big option here is economic sanctions. We have been placing a lot of economic pressure on North Korea for a long time, but there's complications with that as well. And so then the United States, if it runs out of the ability to use economic sanctions, then we've got some big problems. So let's try to now bring this back up to date with talking about the Singapore summit. And so there was a significant breakthrough in this long drama and dynamic between the United States and North Korea. And this crisis that we had just been talking about, this war of words between President Trump and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in March and April of this year. And it was sparked by the hosting of the Winter Olympics in South Korea. And the North Korean regime first accepted then an invitation from the South Korean government to send an official delegation to the Olympics. And this was a big breakthrough. Shortly thereafter, the two governments of North and South Korea formally announced that their leaders would meet for formal talks in April of 2018. And this was the first such high-level meeting between North and South Korea since 2007. And then on March 8th of this year, in a joint press conference with the South Korean National Security Advisor, President Trump announced that he had agreed to meet the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. And this set up the Singapore summit that was later held in June of 2018 between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. In the run-up to the initial summit between the South and North in April, Kim announced a series of important concessions. He said that North Korea was suspending additional missile tests. He said that North Korea would close an underground testing site for nuclear weapons. This was a significant concession by the North Korean government in preparation for its summit with South Korea and with the summit with the United States. This was also a political win then for the Trump administration. Moreover, President Trump made a huge concession by agreeing to the talks with North Korea in the first place. These talks helped legitimize President Kim and strengthen him domestically. He could tell his people now that the United States had been forced to respect North Korea. So
why don't we go ahead, and we've got a video now that is going to kind of explain the situation that emerges after the Singapore summit. Let's go ahead and run that clip.
If the US and North Korea had a Facebook page, each country would change their status to "it's complicated" now. It's not what we had as recently as 2017, when Trump was threatening to go to war over and over again with North Korea.
They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
핵 단추가 내 사무실 책상 위에 항상 놓여 있다는 것.
Now, they're not only on speaking terms, but literally sitting in a room with each other.
We will have a terrific relationship, I have no doubt. Chairman Kim and I just signed a joint statement in which he reaffirmed his unwavering commitment to complete denuclearization.
The problem with this is that Trump and North Korea have very different views about what should be accomplished when you denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. The US wants North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. North Korea wants the United States to stop isolating it diplomatically and stop cutting it off from international markets. In theory, there's the makings of a deal there. For Trump, denuclearization means something called CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. They give up their nuclear weapons, and the US will always be able to make sure that they have gone away. However, for North Korea, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula means something completely different. It means, sure, North Korea gets rid of its nukes, but the US also withdraws all its troops from the Korean Peninsula and ends its alliance with South Korea. This has been unacceptable to every American president in the past.
We will be stopping the war games, which will save us a tremendous amount of money, unless and until we see that the future negotiation is not going along like it should.
What seems really good for North Korea is really bad by American standards. There's just not a great middle ground that could actually roll back North Korea's nuclear program. No country with a nuclear program as advanced as North Korea's has ever denuclearized. A 2017 estimate from the Defense Intelligence Agency concluded that North Korea probably has up to 60 nuclear weapons. It also has ballistic missiles that could potentially hit the American homeland, and potentially a nuclear weapon small enough to fit on one of those rockets. National Security Advisor John Bolton floated an idea for dealing with North Korea that he called
the Libya model.
So this is to reference an agreement struck with the Bush administration by then Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi to give up his nuclear program. However, Gaddafi's program was way more limited. He wasn't really even close to a bomb. And, perhaps more to the point, about 8 years after this agreement was struck, in 2011, the US backed an uprising against Gaddafi, which killed him. To Kim, Libya is an example of what happens if you trust the United States too much. It's an example of what happens if you give up your nuclear weapons. The main reason they want them is to deter an attack. Ideally, they want to deter any war from starting by making the war seem really scary and really dangerous and really bloody.
Normalizing relations is something that I would expect to do, I would hope to do when everything's complete.
Normalization is a prize from North Korea's point of view. It would mean a US embassy in Pyongyang, a North Korean embassy in Washington, ambassadors, formal diplomatic receptions. And I'm saying this, and you're probably imagining that sounds ridiculous. And you're right, because it's North Korea.
Unwavering commitment to the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. This is the document that we just signed.
It's hard to imagine the end game being some kind of big deal. What's more likely is nothing changes or things get worse again.
I think he's going to do these things. I may be wrong. I mean, I may stand before you in 6 months and say, hey, I was wrong. I don't know that I'll ever admit that, but I'll find some kind of an excuse.
Okay.
All right, so where do things stand now? I think the first thing to realize and to emphasize here is that both sides have stepped back from a legitimate military crisis in which there was an increase in the risk of war. This is significant and positive. Right. Both sides develop credit for standing down from this crisis. Second, I think it's fair to say now that we are, in some senses, in another armistice, right? There isn't a deal that is sustainable over getting rid of North Koreans' nuclear weapons program. They've agreed to talk, but they disagree significantly over what denuclearization means. And as you just saw in the video, there's a lot of legitimate skepticism about whether North Korea will ever give up these weapons. The third thing to realize here is that we need to recognize that there are some tactical problems that are emerging in the negotiations that probably stem from holding the summit first before having a negotiating breakthrough. So President Trump has agreed to stop the war games. These are military exercises to signal to the North Korean regime that the U.S. is serious, but it's also to facilitate coordination between the U.S. and its South Korean ally in case an attack actually occurred. It's important to realize that this decision to stop the military exercises, this contradicted advice from the Pentagon. The other thing that's important, and this goes back to something that we already mentioned, that Nikki Haley is upset because she goes to the UN yesterday and said, Russia and China aren't living up to their obligations with the sanctions regime. And the concern is that they have taken as a signal the progress and the decline in tensions between the two sides as it's okay to go back in and to begin trading with Russia and China. And so what she's arguing is that we've lost some leverage here to uphold the one instrument that we have to rely on for pressure because, I mean, she's not saying this publicly, but because we had this summit. Trump also signaled and has signaled that to everyone that he's willing to negotiate a formal peace treaty. And this is what the leaders of North Korea and South Korea are talking about in the summit right now. And the question, though, is, and one of the concerns that's raised in the United States is, what is the U.S. going to get out of signing this? How can we ensure some concessions from North Korea with respect to its nuclear weapons program?
The critique is that we're moving first and giving too much away without getting enough back.
The final thing to point out in all this, and we didn't have time to run another clip, is there are some concerns that the U.S. is surrendering its leverage, and in a sense, North Korea has shifted its strategic game. It has a better understanding of Trump, and the understanding of President Trump is to get President Trump domestic political victories, big public announcements that look like concessions. And they can facilitate that by taking public demonstrations of missiles, missile testings, and nuclear weapons program, taking that off the ground, and go more covert in the development of their nuclear program, adopt a strategy like Pakistan did after 1998, and this is a way that they can coexist. And the concern is that they're not really making any changes in their military program. They've just gone dark, quiet, silent, and the U.S. is getting weaker as a result.
Their strategy is to secretly continue to make nuclear weapons.